I flew into Jackson. Nick Allman picked me up, and we drove about 2 hours south to the small town of Columbia. And on this visit, I ended up touring some of the outlying farms around Columbia of small biracial farming communities who had these toxic leaking waste barrels. What happened is that after the Reichhold chemical plant had exploded years earlier, and it was abandoned, and a fence was put around it, and they had to dispose of all of these barrels of toxic chemicals. Some were simply left above ground, strewn around on the property inside the fences. Others were sold for $1 a barrel to farmers as weed killer.
Wow.
Yes. And so I met this one African-American farmer who told me the story of his cattle who were being born deformed. And he said, I was using that barrel over there. They told me it was good weed killers. And so I sprayed a lot of the property around the pastures to control weeds. But when these calves started being born, I didn't use that stuff anymore. They just told me it was weed killer. And I went over with a photographer from the Jackson news media and looked at the label on some of these barrels. And the labels were warning of danger. And there were particular chemical names on them. And we had pictures taken of the labels. And that reporter went back and issued a front page story the next day about that story, as well as some of the other events that occurred on my visit that time. And that came to the attention of the CEO of Reichhold Chemical, who had his headquarters in the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina.
Oh, he was in North Carolina.
Not far from where I lived. So 3 days later, after I'd returned to Chapel Hill, I got a phone call directly from a Mr. Philip Ashkettle, who identified himself as the CEO and said he had been reading about me in Columbia, Mississippi. And he invited me to talk with him. He wanted to share the perspective of a new generation of chemical CEOs and see if there were accommodations that could be made. Well, the chemical plant itself had closed down, but I can tell you when I visited that farm with the leaking toxic chemical barrels, the fumes were evident. They were overwhelming at times. I was concerned about my own safety at the time. And yet I wanted that reporter to get a photograph, to hear the story from that farmer. And then we got out of there. But it was hearing the stories of the residents who lived near that plant, literally on the other side of the chain link fence. I have a photograph somewhere in my archives of a photograph of the backyard of one of the small homes. Looking out the back window, the chain link fence is about 2 feet beyond their house. And on the other side of it lay toxic waste barrels. So they impressed upon me the suffering they had experienced over years when no one would listen to them. A range of diseases and symptoms, from rashes and headaches and cancers and respiratory diseases. And I wanted Ashkettle to experience that firsthand, to make it real. And I give him enormous credit. Not only did he go down the first time with one aide and spent time in the community listening to them, he returned again a second time by himself and dealt directly with Charlotte Keyes and JPAP. And they ended up reaching an agreement where Reichhold Chemical, after several visits and negotiation, agreed to finance a true health study to determine, to identify the nature of the suffering, different diseases, and were willing to help with medical bills. And the really big element is he agreed to help finance the relocation of many of those homes that were on the front line near the plant.
That's a surprising and significant result of that.
I was very impressed with his support.
What was the process there going from him meeting you as another white man in his office in North Carolina and saying, what kind of deal can we arrange together, you and I, in this room in North Carolina, to this point where he has gone down to visit, to meet with JPAP members to reach that final settlement? What transpired?
I really pulled back from the relationship while a lot of that was happening. Once Philip and I had talked, and we talked by phone a few times, he took it on himself to then initiate the contact and make the arrangements and went down. And they had their conversations. Charlotte Keyes would keep me informed, however, of the progress of that. As a result of this happening, it became apparent that Charlotte and her story of JPAP had national significance, that it could help illustrate the problem of environmental racism from chemical pollution. So we arranged for Charlotte to come to Washington, D.C., and the National Sierra Club and the Washington staff financed the trip. We had Charlotte at the headquarters in Washington and had a press conference of the Washington, D.C. Press Corps so that Charlotte could tell her story to them, the nation's press corps. She told her story, and what I recall most is that one of the, cynical old-time reporters questioned Charlotte and said, "How do you know? What's the evidence that your illness is the result of that chemical plant? Can you prove that?" And Charlotte just kept her composure, and she said simply, "Study me. The evidence is in my body." And
That's such a good story.
And it silenced that reporter. And they got good press out of that. We were also able to arrange a visit at the White House for Charlotte to be able to meet with the Gore administration and some of its officials.
That's significant leverage to be able to bring.
And I must say, I think that was one of several influences coming out of the EJ movement that led President Bill Clinton ultimately to issue his executive order on environmental justice that directed all of the federal agencies to consider environmental justice in their program planning and in the development of their regulations.
That's a big political moment, a big win for institutionally for environmental justice at a national level.
It absolutely was.
That story you told about Charlotte Keyes saying, answering the question of where's the proof, is something that seems to echo through a lot of experiences of environmental justice pioneers and environmental justice activists, particularly as scientific experts come in and say, we need evidence of environmental contamination, and we're going to look at these metrics. And so I'm wondering, I've read some of your work where you bring up something called the indecorous voice. Can you share what you mean by that, the indecorous voice, and how Charlotte represented that in this context?
Sure. It's one of the essays that I published. The concept of decorum is an ancient Latin concept of the proper way of speaking in different forums. And yet the inverse was happening in these EJ communities as they tried to interact with health committees and state regulatory bodies and congressional hearings. They were often challenged for not speaking appropriately, that is to say, with expertise and knowing the technical language, and therefore they were not fitting or appropriate for that context. They had become the indecorous voice. Well, a lot of the challenge coming out of the EJ movement was to shake and rattle the official forums to gain a hearing. And it sometimes took a lot of aggressive action. It took the support of other groups. It took a movement coming together to demand a hearing. And I think it was the leadership and composure and the savvy sense of helping build a movement that people like Charlotte Keyes brought to the table.